We can now turn to the book of John. It's the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel, as some would say. And we will read the 13th chapter. Our text for the sermon today will come from verses 2 through 17. It's John 13, and we'll begin reading at verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." And Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. And when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." Thus far, God's Word. Brothers and sisters, last week we began a series on chapters 13 through 17 of the book of John. These chapters, of course, are the final words of Jesus, the final teachings of Jesus to his disciples before he goes to the cross, before he leaves, we could say. And it is my thesis, and based on the thoughts of others, that in these chapters we discover the heart of Jesus. What does Jesus want to tell his disciples in the last time he has with them? And last week we saw in chapter 13 that Jesus' heart for the disciples is set on loving them. And not just loving them, but loving them to perfection, to the end. And as part of showing his love for his disciples and to show them how much he loves them and to what extent he's willing to go, we now have our passage for today, John 13. And Jesus washes the feet of his disciples as a dramatic sign of where his heart lies. And together we're going to see how powerful this really is and what it means for us too under this theme. As Jesus washes his feet, so we ought to wash each other's feet. Number one, we'll see putting on the towel. And number two, Peter says no. And number three, washing as a prototype. And so if you read verse 2, it says, "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil has already prompted Judas," or had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now we'll leave the matters of Judas aside for today, and next week we'll talk about that in detail. The key thing here is that the evening meal is in progress, and this appears to be the Last Supper, or Jesus' last meal with the disciples. And verse 3 is where the drama begins. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Now, first, this is sort of an odd verse. Why say this? But look at what Jesus says next. Right? So there's this is the first part of the sentence. Jesus knew that the Father put all things under his feet, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And this verse, that at first seems a bit confusing, becomes a bit clearer if you see that word "so" in between. So here you have Jesus recognizes that all power in heaven and earth is given to him. And realizing he has all power on heaven and earth and that he's going to dwell in the throne room of God, what is his first act? What does he feel would be the most appropriate thing that he could do? Well, he wraps a towel around his waist and begins to wash feet. Now, it's important to recognize something here. The previous 12 chapters of John covered, 1 to 3 years of Jesus' life. We're not sure. And if you look at 12 chapters to cover 1 to 3 years of Jesus' life, that's like a very bird's eye view of what's going on. And now, here in this chapter 13, we have one act given incredible detail. It means that this passage is incredibly important for what it reveals about Jesus and his heart. There's an emphasis here. And what's the emphasis? Well, the emphasis to me is on the contrast between how great Jesus is and what he does. Think about who is Jesus if he's given power over heaven and earth. Power over all things. One church father said it this way. He said, "He who feeds everyone is eating at the table. The fountain of wisdom among the ignorant. He who sustains the whole world is receiving sustenance at a meal. He who pours water into the rivers of the earth is pouring water into a basin. He who is clothed with light in the heavens is girded with a towel. And he who holds water in the clouds and sealed the abyss, so to speak, Satan's lair, is bound with a belt." The resident, he who is seated on the throne room of God in heaven at the right hand of the Father himself, is about to get on his knees dressed as a servant. And it's not just that he washes the feet as some sort of symbol. He actually does it for each disciple. He doesn't do it for one disciple, he does for 12, including Judas, the one who is about to betray him. Which means that he shows grace to people who don't always believe in him, but we'll get to that. And he does every part of it too. He took off his outer clothing. He wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into the basin. Nobody helped him do any of it. He washed the feet fully and then dried them. The Son of God took sewage-covered, dusty, grimy, wart-covered feet in his own hands and washed them. Even in Western culture, this is a rather shocking act. But in the Middle East at that time, And even in the Roman world, this was even more shocking than most of us would realize. I mean, yes, in the Middle East, foot washing was a way of life. People wore sandal-like shoes in the Middle East typically. The feet were always dusty and dirty, even right after taking a bath. And cities weren't clean places, and sewage was often running in the streets, and people would dump their garbage all over the place. And so part of entering a house was to wash your feet. Particularly important before meals and hospitality. This was always done. Typically, if you went to someone's house, if the host was gracious, they would give you water so that you could wash your feet. That is the default. But even beyond that, if you were wealthy, then servants might do this job. Some said that servants couldn't be ordered to do this. I'm not so sure. Maybe, maybe not. That's not a clear thing. In fact, what is true biblically is that throughout the Old Testament, foot washing is mentioned. And foot washing is so demeaning, especially in some of the Psalms, that it's seen as something that victors would do to their defeated enemies. And maybe a more positive example in the Old Testament is 1 Samuel 25, where Abigail, one of David's wives, as she approaches David, she volunteers to wash David's feet and all the feet of David's servants. And she calls herself a servant and then volunteers to wash their feet. There's this association between servanthood and foot washing. Foot washing is seen to be something that only servants do, and it's humiliating for anyone other than a servant to do it. And if you look at the historical background, which has been extensively covered by commentators, an equal might wash the feet of another equal at some point in great love. And in fact, in Song of Songs, there's a mention of something like that. But never is there recorded in antiquity, never, that we know of, is there an instance in which a superior washes the feet of a subordinate. One commentator says it this way. He says, Jesus' action is unparalleled in ancient literature. No other master voluntarily condescends to perform this act for a subordinate. And Jesus, of course, is the disciples' Lord and teacher. He is their social superior. They are his students. Never has a historical figure of any kind washed the feet of his subordinates. And so this is an incredibly shocking act. In the ancient world, and it still is today. And it bends the human mind on two ends. First of all, Jesus is greater than we can even imagine or dare possible. He knew the Father had put all things under his power, that he had come from God and was returning to God. Which means that Jesus is the greatest human being that has ever lived. No other human being has ever done something like that. And yet, here is the greatest of all humans, because he's God, doing something and demeaning himself to do something that only the lowest of humans would do. And even then, that the lowest of humans rarely would consent to do. The highest becoming the lowest voluntarily. That is what this is about. We read this in Matthew 23. The greatest among you will be your servant. There's also another interesting passage in Luke 12 where Jesus says, this is the parable of the servants that are meant to be watching for when Jesus returns or when the master returns. And he says, it will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve and will have them recline at the table and will come and wait on them. So the servants who wait for Jesus to return, or for their master in the parable at least, when the master does return, the master is going to wait at the table and serve them. And so this humble act of Jesus shakes our world to its core on multiple levels. And it certainly shook the disciples. And this is our second point. Peter says no. Like verse 6, he's washing the disciples' feet. He's going around the table. He comes to Peter. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Really? Are you going to wash my feet?" You can kind of hear the inflection in Peter's voice. Peter is appalled by Jesus' actions. In fact, I would imagine all the disciples are appalled by Jesus. Jesus is doing something that is not done socially. It is not acceptable culturally for someone to do this. Now, Peter is the only one who speaks up as normal. And besides, who can really say no to Jesus anyway? Well, Peter can. And Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." That doesn't help Peter. Peter says, "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Now, Jesus knows Peter doesn't fully understand. But in fact, what we should comment on is that Peter does halfway understand. Peter understands that Jesus is the Son of God. Peter understands that Jesus is Lord and the Messiah. In fact, Peter has great faith. Peter believes the truth about Jesus, but he's missing something. He's missing the ethos of Jesus, how Jesus is going to act and be as Lord, and how Jesus is going to exercise his lordship. I think again we see as Christians how easy it is to have a stunted view of Jesus. It's so easy to see part of Jesus and to not see the other parts. I would argue that much of what we do in our lives is directly related to how we perceive Jesus. And Peter perceives Jesus as Lord and King, and so therefore Peter expects Jesus to use the forces of domination to achieve his goals and to restore Israel. And Peter, as a result, whips out his sword later to protect Jesus. Violence is part of the ethos of Jesus, Peter thinks. I would argue, too, that what we do as Christians is almost entirely determined by who we think Jesus is and how we think he advances his kingdom. If you think Jesus is a fluffy, nice guy, then you probably have a soft view of sin. If you think Jesus is a harsh master demanding perfect discipline and obedience from his people, then you're probably pretty harsh with other people and yourself. And, perhaps most importantly with this text, if you can't see Jesus as your servant, then you likely have no interest in serving others as their servant. And yet, look at what Jesus says to Peter. "Unless I wash you, you have no part in me." Peter, if you don't let me be your servant, you can't be part of my kingdom. In order to be one of my own, you must accept that I am going to wash your feet. Of course, Simon replies, "Then Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head and my hands as well." Well, why don't you just wash all of me then? If this is this important, just wash my whole body. And Jesus says no. Now, Peter is a little bit confused here. And the best way to see this is to think that Peter views the foot washing of Jesus as some type of baptism. Peter knew that becoming baptized was an important part of becoming part of Jesus' kingdom. Peter says, okay, if this foot washing, this is another kind of baptism, another sacrament or something, hey, by all means, I'm all for it. But Jesus says, no, that's not what's happening. He says, look, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Why? Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. Of course, Judas is the one who is not clean. Now, Jesus was baptized. And we have to assume that from that, the other disciples were baptized as well. In fact, early on in the Gospels, the disciples themselves are baptizing others. In John 4, verse 2, for example. We would assume that if the disciples are baptizing other people, that they would also be baptized. And so Jesus is saying to Peter, no, you don't need to have some sort of full body washing like baptism again. But you do need to be regularly washed by me, even though you're already clean. You already know me, but you're going to keep sinning, which means you need to be cleansed again and again. That's why he says your feet need to be washed, even though your whole body is clean. And now, here's where there's another layer in the foot washing. So there's the layer of servanthood, but now there's another layer. In what way do we receive the foot washing of Jesus? Why does he need to wash our feet? The truth is that his foot washing anticipates the later death of Jesus on the cross. Jesus dying as a common criminal is in fact to make himself our servant. Dying on a cross was to make himself low in order to serve his own. And Jesus is telling Peter, if you don't accept my death, the death you should have made, but I'm going to make in your place for you, then you can't have any part in me. You will not be forgiven unless you recognize and believe that I need to die for you. You see, every one of us has guilt from our sin. We deserve the wrath of God for what we've done. And unless Jesus serves us with the cross, we can't receive forgiveness from that punishment. And again, there's this sense in which at baptism, Jesus says, I have washed you clean with my blood. I have washed you for all time. You are now clean in my eyes. And then there's this sense, but then the next day we sin, and we sin again, and we sin again, and then we need to be washed again, and we need to be washed again. Again, I'm clean, but my feet are dirty, and they need to keep being washed. But most importantly, brothers and sisters, the point is that what's central to salvation is that we learn that Jesus serves us as a servant, even in his death. And he graciously gives us his service, and we can't change that. We can't act like we're too good for it. We as Christians are receivers. And there's no paying that back. That's why this church is called Grace Canadian Reformed Church, because you come here to receive grace. And growing as a Christian means to just learn to accept more and more and more of that grace. That's ultimately what being a Christian is. It's to take all those parts of your life that you think you can control and give them up to the grace of Jesus. So take the income that you earn and say, wow, that was grace from God. I can be gracious with that. You know, us human beings, we struggle with this. We're like people with a broken down car on the side of the road. I think some of us have been in this situation. Maybe you blow a tire or something's wrong with your engine. And you can't fix the car. Maybe your phone is broken and you can't call a tow truck. And yet when someone comes to help you, at least if you're me, maybe not all of you are like me. When someone comes to help you and volunteers to fix the car, there's this part of us that resents that. God, I wish I could do that, How can I let someone help me like that? How incompetent am I? There's this sense of you that says, no, I'm okay. I'll try to take care of it. If you just give me your phone, I'll call somebody and that person will come and fix it and I'll pay them. Because taking your grace is a little much for me. Why don't we ask for directions or just let the guy fix the car? Let him spend 4 hours at it. He wants to give it to you. Just take it. How many of us live our lives this way? We can't even take the smallest thing from other people. We're so proud. Why not accept grace? But true faith, you see, is to simply look to Jesus and say, I'll take it. There's in fact, without it, I'm dead. And not only will I take it today, I need to take it tomorrow and the day after that and the next week and the week after, and I need grace all the time. I need grace for eternity. There's absolutely nothing I can do to pay that back. And if Jesus says that he'll wash your feet, if he'll do the lowest of tasks for you, then that means he'll also do from the lowest task to the highest task, he'll do all things for you. And he needs to, because you and I aren't capable of very much. This brings us to our third point, washing as a prototype. It was fascinating in verse 12, Jesus moves one step further. Right, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Right, do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. What is this about, disciples? What are you going to learn from what I've just done? He says, okay, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Yes. You see, this is Peter, right? Of course, Peter, I am your Lord. You're correct to see that. And normally you wouldn't let your Lord serve you. But there's more. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. And now 3 statements come next that say exactly the same thing. Right? Number 1, I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Number 2, truly, very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. And number 3, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. You see? 3 times Jesus says, you must now do as I have done. And if you plan to have a part in me, if you plan to be one of my own, this will be the way in which you live your life. Right? Do as I have done. No servant is greater than his master. So don't assume that you can live your life in a different way than me, because by so doing, you think you're greater than me. Don't. And most encouragingly, you will be blessed if you live this way. I, Jesus says, will graciously give you and fill you up with whatever you think you're lacking in need. Here you have the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are. Why? Because such a person experiences the favor and blessing of God. Now, is Jesus saying that foot washing is like a sacrament? This is how many people read this passage. We have Lord's Supper, we have baptism. Maybe we should also do foot washing in our church. Is that what? I think some weddings, from time to time, we might see this, where the groom or the bride might wash each other's feet or something to that effect. Is that really what Jesus is sort of getting at here? I don't think so. In Western culture, it is not shameful to wash another person's feet. And in fact, most of our feet, perhaps except mine, are pretty dirty, or not dirty, and not very gross. Well, some of our feet are are gross. They're pretty smelly. But generally speaking, we're not walking around with sandals and sewage. So the fact of the matter is that for a Westerner like us to wash another person's feet is way too easy of an application of this text. It tends to be why I think washing feet at a wedding is a little bit ridiculous. Like, it's not that hard. I appreciate the symbol, but it doesn't really get to the core of the point. In Western culture, what is it to wash each other's feet? What would be something that we would consider beyond too much? And I think there's two aspects here. On the one hand, Jesus is saying there should be no job that's too demeaning for you to do for another Christian. Or even beyond Christianity. That's number one. And number two, there's no extent to which you shouldn't go to show love to someone in the kingdom. And again, perhaps beyond. Now, I'll give you an example that struck me in my own life, and you can take it for what it is. This is what made it real to me. So in my house, with my own children, generally speaking, I can barely do things like change diapers. Potty training, wiping snotty noses, it's almost beyond my ability. And in fact, I try to shirk it at every opportunity. Lisa, praise the Lord, does it without complaining. This is a real failure on my part as a husband. Now recently, we cared for somebody else's children. They were having a baby, and we helped them by caring for their children for a few days. Now, of course, in the abstract, I was happy to do this. Of course we should do this. But then I realized that at some point, I might have to change a diaper of someone else's kid. I can barely do it with my own. Now I have to do it for someone else's, and it's like, oh, no, not doing that. Nope. It's great to have the kids and everything, but it's just, I'm just not going to go to that extent. But then there was this moment in which I had no choice but to help one of these two boys use the toilet. And right in that moment, I was tested, because if I didn't help him, disaster would strike. And right in that moment, I believe God convicted me, because in that moment I was like, wait a second, who am I to be too good or too high for this thing? Who am I to say that this is too demeaning for me? What, I'm a pastor now, I don't have to do stuff like this? There's a limit to my love now? Look at this poor boy, he needs my help. I think in that moment I was convicted to the core of, I had carefully bounded my love. I'm willing to love this people to this extent, but not this and not that. Who am I to make limits? I think in that moment that this passage came alive. An unusual moment, no doubt. And I would argue we all have this, you see. We all get to the point where we think that, we're going to contribute this much, but not this. And I choose how much I'm going to love, and there's all those jobs I'm not going to do. Or my church can have, 15 minutes of my week, but an hour, there's just all these things that we do. And the applications are endless. Like, are you willing to host some people in your home, but not others? Do you go out of your way to bless all of your brothers and sisters, or do you just choose a certain number of people in this church that you want to show love to, but others, you don't really like them, so what? Or in your house. Are you willing to change diapers as a husband? Right? Or if your spouse regularly does the dishes, why wouldn't you do the dishes once or twice or more regularly? Like this foot washing of Jesus, it is unbelievably practical. It touches every single aspect of our lives. Or even wives, right? Or mothers, like, do we care for our children grudgingly? Is it because we have to, or do we no, it's my position in life to serve these children. And I gladly do this. In any career, we can make applications. Like even teachers. Do you begrudge your job as a teacher, or do you love teaching because you view yourself as Christ's servant to the children? I think those of us who are caring for an ailing spouse, we already know all about this. Not because we instantly got good at caring for our spouse, but because we were eventually crushed through long trial in our own hearts to move to the place where we realized this is how our life had to go. And you've learned that that's the price of love. And the thing is that how does someone get to the point where, and there's this book that was once published, and there were two brothers, and one was successful in ministry, and the other one was also successful for a time, but his wife got sick. And they wrote a book, and they said, whose life had more worth? The one that had to quit ministry and spend years caring for his sick wife? Or the one who had success in ministry and blessed so many people with his sermons, blah, blah, blah? Whose life had more worth in God's eyes? And they concluded the book by saying, we can't say. They both have worth in the way that God laid out their worth. I think some of us have realized this through stark necessity. But those of us who haven't realized it yet, remember, Jesus does this for you. You know, it's not that we have to serve other people. It's that Jesus says, look, this is what I do for you. Look at what I did. Now you work out how that's going to work in your life. And yes, there is an extent to which if you can't serve other people, that might mean that you don't understand that Jesus has served you. Are you his own if you can't do that? But the fact of the matter is that most of us grudgingly do this anyway. And if we struggle to love, that shouldn't surprise us, because that's what being sinful is. And David Powlison, the great Christian counselor, said once, he said, people learn to love extremely slowly. I think it's very difficult for us to turn away from selfishness to actually being servant and foot-washing people. And that slow process shouldn't lead us to despair of our faith. But yet the progress needs to progress. The Lord of heaven and earth, when recognizing his ultimate lordship, in that very instant, got on his knees, picked up a towel, wrapped it around his waist, filled a basin, and touched sewage-filled feet. And then after that, he went to a cross where he was nailed to it, whipped, and humiliated. And he never complained. In fact, he did it. Like, we think the cross is passive, but it's active on Jesus' part. He did it. He went to it willingly for you. No person here could ever serve another person more than Jesus did in these chapters of John. And if that's what Jesus did, what reasonably should we do with our lives? How do we ever get to a different place than foot washing? Well, that's where our sin pushes us. That's where it pushes me. I have one more thing before we go. Today we have the profession of faith of Adolfo Chavez. Adolfo came to us last spring. He and I met weekly for discipleship training. Now he's here, ready to be a member of God's church. Adolfo, if you should know, grew up Roman Catholic and was baptized in Mexico in that church. And the Roman Catholic Church has a muddled view of grace. Sometimes they teach it, and other times it's not so much. And my most vivid memory of Adolfo coming to my office was the first class. right away I recognized that we needed to talk about salvation by grace alone. Adolfo did not know this. He did not know that he was saved by grace alone. He thought he had to work for his salvation. And I still remember the look on his face when he realized that everything was from grace. I'll never forget it. He was stunned that such a thing could be true. But when I showed him from Scripture that it had to be true, he never rejected it for an instant, but took it on and believed it. And afterward, Adolfo learned many things. But nothing imprinted itself more deeply on his psyche than that fundamental first lesson on grace and then, of course, love. He had felt the love of Christ before, but to see the extent of it, that's never left him. And he immediately has applied that love and that grace in his own life. One of the major reasons he's ready to enter Christ's church today. Now, Adolfo is no different than any of you. He's a sinner saved by grace. He sees grace and he loves because the grace of Jesus has entered his heart and produced that change. And so the point of me saying all of this is that if Jesus can change Adolfo today here, then, and if Adolfo can actually change his life and begin to live in love towards other people with tangible results, then the same exact thing can happen to you. It is happening, perhaps, in you. The point being, the words that we say here, you see, John 13, we come to church, we hear words. They're not just words. They're real. They're making a real impact in real people, in real time, in real places. The evidence is in the pew right here. So if you're here today and you still think the gospel is abstract, do not. It's real. And Jesus washing our feet is real. It actually happened. And it is happening as we speak. And it's for you, not for someone else. Although other people's examples of faith should show you that it absolutely can be for you. So come to Jesus if you haven't already. Or if you've been far from him, return to him. And be washed that you may wash others. Amen.